Today, we're tackling a question about ancient identity that has a surprisingly complex answer. We're talking about two words you've probably used interchangeably your whole life: Hebrew and Israelite. But what if I told you one was a name given by outsiders, and the other was an identity they claimed for themselves?
Yeah, for most of us, these words are basically synonyms, right? We just swap them out. But the historical evidence, it tells a totally different and way more interesting story. Okay, so this whole thing is really like a puzzle. It's a puzzle of identity, of perception, and even of power. So let's dive in and start piecing together the clues to solve this thing.
First up, let's look at why we so often treat these terms as interchangeable. And a big part of it is that we miss this really crucial element, the power dynamic behind who gets to do the naming.
See, we just assume they're two different names for the exact same group of people. But the real truth is all about who is speaking and, just as important, why they're speaking. It's the classic difference between how the world sees you versus how you see yourself. Okay, so let's get into our first big clue. It comes from just looking at when and where the word Hebrew actually pops up in the biblical texts. And once you start looking for the pattern, it's incredibly consistent.
Take a look at this. Potiphar's wife, an Egyptian noblewoman, says, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us." Notice who's talking here. An Egyptian, right? She is using Hebrew like an accusation, a way to frame Joseph as this foreign threat. It's not just a name, it's a weapon.
And we see the exact same thing again. Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby Moses, and what does she say? This is one of the Hebrews' children. Again, it's an Egyptian perceiving him through a social lens, labeling him as part of the slave population. This one really drives the point home. The prophet Jonah himself, when he needs to identify himself to a bunch of foreign sailors, what does he say? I am a Hebrew. He doesn't say, I am an Israelite. Why? Because he's talking to outsiders and he uses the label they would understand.
So when you lay it all out, the pattern is just crystal clear. The word Hebrew consistently shows up in foreign courts, during slavery, in legal situations with outsiders, or in conflicts. And as we just saw, it's what you call yourself when you're talking to foreigners. The crucial point here is that Hebrew is almost always a label used by or for outsiders, often in context of vulnerability.
Okay, so that brings us to our next section, an insider's identity. If Hebrew was the term outsiders used for them, what term did these people use for themselves?
Well, it turns out the internal name, the one used by the narrator, by the prophets, and even by God in the covenant, is almost always Israelite. This wasn't just another name. It was a powerful statement about their lineage, their community, and this unique relationship they had with their God. And when you put them side by side like this, the difference is just boom. It's so clear. Hebrew is all about the outsider's perspective, right? It's about social status, used by people like Egyptians and Philistines. But Israelite, that's the insider's view. It's about lineage and covenant, used by the narrator, prophets, God himself. Put simply, Hebrew is what outsiders see, while Israelite is who they are.
All right, moving on. Now, this pattern isn't just some literary device in a book. It's actually backed up by some amazing clues from the wider ancient world.
Check this out. For centuries, ancient texts from all over the Near East talk about these groups called the Habiru or Apiru. Now, this wasn't an ethnic group. It was a social class, a label for outsiders, refugees, mercenaries, basically people living on the margins of society. Sound familiar? It's an absolutely striking parallel to how the Bible uses the word Hebrew.
And this timeline of evidence shows this really fascinating shift. For a long time, around the 1400s BCE, you see this term Habiru all over the place describing this broad social class. But then, around 1205 BCE, something new happens. The name Israel shows up on the scene as a specific people group. We're literally watching a vague social label give way to a distinct named people. And that brings us to 1205 BCE. This is the year of the Merneptah Stele, the first known mention of Israel outside of the Bible. It's a huge piece of evidence. An Egyptian pharaoh is bragging about his military victories, and he says Israel is laid waste. This is so critical because it shows that by this point, Egypt recognized Israel as a specific group in Canaan, not just some generic Habiru. Okay, final section, let's put it all together. Let's synthesize all these clues, the language, the history, and build a clear picture of how this identity actually evolved. So here's how it likely went down.
First, you start with this broad landscape of Hebrew peoples, a social category for all kinds of mobile groups. Then, out of that landscape, one specific lineage, the children of Israel, starts to form. They then solidify this unique identity based on a shared story, a shared lineage, and a covenant. And the result? Israel becomes their main, internal name, while Hebrew sticks around as a useful but secondary label used by outsiders. This isn't a story of two synonyms, it's a story of evolution.
So the big takeaway here is that the children of Israel were a subset of this broader Hebrew category, but they were the ones who forged this incredibly powerful and lasting identity. Think of it this way. All Israelites could be called Hebrews in certain situations, but not all the people out there being called Hebrews were necessarily Israelites. And all of this really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other identities in history started out not as a name someone chose for themselves, but as a label given to them by outsiders? It's a great reminder of how perception shapes reality and how the names we're called by others can be so different from the names we call ourselves.